of conflict, yeah, what does the future of conflict look like when it's no longer just being fought on land, sea, or air, but in the boundless realm of space, where weapons are hidden in dual purpose technology, satellites are both crucial but also vulnerable, and they can be taken out in as little as 4 to 6 minutes. So the Space Force is ready for that future today. Good afternoon. I'm Major Stephen St. John, currently serving in the United States Space Force and working as a SkillBridge Aerospace and Defense Program Management Fellow at the University of Tennessee Space Institute in Huntsville. I've been in the Air Force for 22 years, serving as a space systems operator, overseeing GPS, missile warning, and some experimental satellites. My experience also includes electromagnetic warfare, to include satellite communications jamming and PNT jamming. Additionally, I've controlled nuclear ICBMs and provided intelligence analysis to both special operations and to Space Force senior leaders. So real quick, I'll briefly explain the purpose and the content of the 4-part series on the Space Force that we're going to put on, and then we'll deep dive into this one. All right, so over the next few weeks, what we're going to do is my goal is to give you a high level understanding of why a Space Force is essential, and clear up any misconceptions there might be that it's just like the Netflix series. We'll also cover unclassified threat systems. Our competitors are developing and fielding to challenge our ability to use space to our strategic advantage, and how that landscape is actually evolving. I'll also show you how the Space Force is optimizing its capabilities, people, and readiness to meet those challenges. And each session will also include a Q&A with a senior mentor. And we have Brigadier General retired Damon Feltman with us today, and he'll speak here in a little bit. Additionally, we'll go ahead and we'll kickstart a dialogue with industry partners seeking the talent that you possess, helping you identify potential career steps as you graduate or just further develop within the field. One thing that I'll ask from you today is please hold any questions until the Q&A session at the end, or go ahead and just type them in the chat so that we don't miss them and we can come back and we can answer those at the end. All right, this is part 1, From Earth to Orbit, so a guide about Guardians. All right, we'll kick this off with a short 3-minute video that partially highlights why we need a Space Force, and then I'll further unpack that throughout the brief.
Behind this razor-wired fence in Colorado, a highly classified Space Force asset. Under heavy armed guard, this 18-wheeler packed with high-value satellite comms is one of several mobile command centers poised to roll out in the event of a doomsday attack that would target U.S. military satellite control. If you need to, how fast can you move these trucks out?
The specific timelines are classified, but what I can say is a matter of hours.
Thank you. Line up.
At the main Space Force Satellite Ops Center, our cameras were the first ever let inside.
Line down.
It's here that they keep watch over America's military satellites and the world's GPS network, operating in an increasingly hostile environment.
It is truly a warfighting domain. Our adversaries are fielding specific weapon systems in the domain, so we need to view it as such.
The Pentagon says Russia and China are the chief adversaries. In November, a Russian satellite targeted and blew up another Russian satellite, creating a massive orbiting debris field. China conducted a similar test in 2007. U.S. commanders believe China has deployed a satellite with a robotic arm to reach out and grab other satellites. And Russia has nesting satellites loaded with offensive weapons.
And liftoff.
The head of Space Force says U.S. commercial and military satellites are routinely harassed.
Whether it's jamming or harmful interference in the RF spectrum, laser dazzling, cyber attacks, cyber probing and cyber attacks.
Those attacks monitored 24/7 in this classified command center. More than 70% of military satellite communications come through here. Everything from nuclear command and control orders to presidential communications, down to a Coast Guard cutter, a submarine, even tactical units on the ground.
And if they don't have the communications when they need it, things can go seriously wrong.
As the Navy has sailors, the new Space Force has guardians, many with engineering degrees and now training for the new battlefield. The concern, the Pentagon says China is now outpacing the U.S. in launches and modernizing its own space capabilities, building a remote robotic post on the far side of the moon, invisible to U.S. satellites.
If we don't start accelerating our development and delivery capabilities, they will exceed it.
Commanders here worry Beijing and Moscow could one day deploy offensive military weapons in the space between the moon and Earth, an area called cislunar.
We don't want there to be a war in space. We want all of humanity to continue to use all the benefits of space for all of our good. But if others choose to start a war there, we'll be ready.
And you believe the threat is growing exponentially and by the day?
Absolutely, and that goes without question. We've seen the public testing of China and Russia.
Tom, it's fascinating and a little bit disturbing. How much worry is there about the militarization of space, especially given Space Force's budget will soon rival NASA's?
The generals that we talk to are worried. They say, listen, this is the reality that we're living in every single day with aggressive action by Russia and China. And they believe China could overtake the U.S. in space capabilities in less than 8 years.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel.
All right,
Follow
so that I
today's-
gave you a little highlight of kind of why we have a Space Force, but let me further unpack that, and I'll do that through this roadmap right here. So we'll talk about these things as I go through this. All right, so why a Space Force? Space is obviously critical to modern life for several key reasons. Satellites are essential for global communications. They enable everything from phone calls to internet access to television broadcast. Without them, much of our interconnected world would grind to a halt. Global Positioning System, or GPS, helps with navigation for everything from driving directions to aircraft flight paths and industries like shipping and logistics. Space is also very crucial for the global economy, supporting financial markets via the secure communications. And as our reliance on space grows, its importance will only continue to increase. So now let's consider its role in national security. All right, so multi-domain operations, they integrate maritime, land, air, cyber, and space to enhance coordination and effectiveness. Each domain supports the others, and they provide critical data, and they also disrupting any kind of enemy actions, which leads to faster decisions and stronger response to threats. And space is really the backbone for all of these domains, as satellites enable that secure long-haul passing of data and voice, intelligence collection and dissemination, and the military coordination required. Disruptions in space and to those systems would cripple military operations, and protecting space infrastructure is essential to national security. Now you might be wondering, protected from what? So I'm kind of glad that you asked that. So America's space interest, we face significant risks due to global competition, technological vulnerabilities, underfunding, and limited coordination and strategy. But today, let's focus on competition and vulnerabilities for now. Nations like China and Russia, they're rapidly advancing their space capabilities, with China making major progress in satellite technology and military space assets. Their growing space presence presents a strategic challenge to the United States, as they may use space to enhance geopolitical influence as well as gain a military advantage. Additionally, satellites that are key for communication, navigation, and intelligence are also very vulnerable to anti-satellite weapons, electronic warfare, and cyber attacks. So as our reliance on space grows, so do the risks to these assets. And this is only a taste. So we'll dive deeper into the threats in the next part of the series in 2 weeks. So stay tuned for that and go ahead and sign up. All right, so I've shared why we need a dedicated force to secure space and ensure its critical capabilities are always available. But a common question that I get is, why create a separate branch when space operations were already being handled by the Air Force? So the Air Force, they managed space for decades, but its focus was really spread across multiple domains, including air, land, and cyber. So establishing the Space Force enabled a more focused strategy to develop and protect those space assets, while also addressing some growing threats from adversaries like China and Russia. It also allows for better resource allocation, policy development, and budget management, specifically for space programs. Speaking about budgets, we received a question from the audience prior to the start of this. The question was, how does the Space Force compete in the Program Objective Memorandum, or the POM process? All right, so first and foremost, Space Force competes for funding in the POM process by aligning its priorities to national defense goals. It then will submit its budget request through the Department of the Air Force, detailing specific needs like satellite infrastructure, missile defense, and technology development. And then the Space Force will then compete with other branches for resources by advocating for its critical role in national security, especially in response to those threats from the adversaries like China and Russia. Leaders will then go and justify their funding needs through strategic alignment, cost effectiveness, and congressional advocacy. Ultimately, though, Congress approves the POM and they allocate funds based on national defense priorities. So let me dive into some of the core functions of the Space Force so you can kind of see how those align. All right, the first core function is in space, or controlling the domain. This involves ensuring that U.S. space can operate without interference by protecting those satellites from attacks, countering any threats that may happen, and preventing adversaries from using space for hostile purposes. It also includes managing critical space systems and monitoring the space environment to detect and track objects, space debris, and any adversary activities that could threaten any kind of space assets. Next, we have from space, or exploiting that domain. And so this involves space-based sensors to detect and track missile launches, providing early warning and supporting missile defense systems. It also includes gathering intelligence from space sensors to monitor adversary activities on Earth, such as movements in missile launches. Additionally, it facilitates secure global communication and provides critical navigation services through space-based systems. And lastly, we have to space, or accessing the domain. This involves launching new satellites and maintaining or replacing existing systems to meet military and intelligence requirements. It also includes ensuring that spacecraft and satellites reach the correct orbit and maintain or reposition those space-based assets as needed. All right, now you kind of understand the Space Force's mandate, why it needed to become its own service, and its broad focus areas. Let's quickly discuss some of the organizational structure. So the Department of the Air Force is part of the United States Department of Defense, encompassing both the Air Force and the Space Force. Similar to how the Department of Navy includes both the Navy and the Marine Corps. While the Space Force is not directly part of the Air Force, it operates under the same structure. Operationally, it falls under the Secretary of the Air Force, who oversees both branches. This structure allows the Space Force to access resources, logistics, administrative support from the Air Force, which has decades of experience managing personnel, bases, and systems that are related to space operations. This support enables the Space Force to really focus on their mission and not the administrative piece of it. Despite being under the Department of the Air Force, though, the Space Force has chosen a more streamlined command structure. So now let's go ahead and compare the different levels of command between the Air Force and Space Force. All right, so on the left, what you see is the Air Force structure, and on the right is the Space Force structure. The key difference here is that the Space Force has eliminated 2 levels of command, creating a flatter organization. So with fewer management layers, communication should be more direct and transparent. Entry-level personnel have better access to decision makers and critical information. And with fewer approval steps, inherently, decisions are made more quickly. So this structure really enhances agility and responding to some of those operational challenges and requirements. Additionally, personnel may feel more empowered to share their ideas, suggest improvements, and propose innovative solutions that foster creativity and help the Space Force remain competitive in that fast evolving space domain. So now that you kind of understand the command structure, let's take a look at some of the units that are in the Space Force. Okay, I'm not going to have a lot of time to go in depth in any one of the organizations, their mission or their subordinate units, but here's an overview to help guide kind of your research. So at the top, you have the Space Force, which oversees all the units. To the right, there are two direct reporting units that are focused on innovation and specialized knowledge. So first, you have the Space Rapid Capabilities Office, also known as Space RCO, and some people call it SPARCO, which focuses on the rapid development and deployment of space capabilities to meet urgent needs. Next to that, you have the Space Development Agency, also known as SDA, which has an operating facility in Huntsville. It develops and transitions resilient military space-based sensing, tracking, and a data transport capability into multi-orbit architecture. And at the bottom, there are 3 field commands that handle distinct areas, but also they collaborate to ensure that space operations are effective. So from left to right, what you have is in the yellow border, you have the Space Systems Command, also known as SSC. It's responsible for developing, acquiring, and sustaining space systems and technology, keeping the U.S. capabilities cutting edge, essentially. In the middle, you have Space Training and Readiness Command, or STARCOM. You'll notice some of our naming conventions are kind of catchy. They focus on training Space Force personnel, creating programs and standards for effective space operations. And then lastly, on the right, you have Space Operations Command, also known as SPOC. So there's another one. And what they do is they ensure protection of U.S. and allied interest in space, including satellite operations, space surveillance, missile warning, and space communications. All right, now I'll go ahead and I'll address the elephant in the room. So U.S. Space Command, everybody in Northern Alabama and Southern Tennessee is very interested in this. No, I don't know if it's moving to Huntsville for sure. I checked the news right before we started this brief and I didn't see any update yet, but I heard a decision's probably going to come very, very soon. And then after that, I think some funding will start flowing to make a permanent location for U.S. Space Command. But one question I get all the time is, all right, so what's the difference between those two organizations, Space Command and U.S. Space Force? So let me real quickly kind of clarify the distinction between those because the naming is so similar that so many people think they're the same entity. So the Space Force is a military branch, much like the Air Force, the Army, or the Navy, responsible for organizing, training, and equipping its personnel and systems. Space Command, on the other hand, is a geographic combatant command, like INDOPACOM, CENTCOM, or EUCOM. So they're responsible for executing space operations in support of national security objectives. So I know that's a lot to digest, and it's very high level right there. And trust me, there's times where I'm like, hey, is that Space Force or is that Space Command? But you'll see, it's not hard to understand the differences between the two once you hear them and you kind of think about it a little bit. So now let's focus on what's most important in real estate, which is location, location, location. So this graphic right here shows where the different CONUS units are located. What you'll probably notice is that about 70% of the units are located in Colorado Springs, Denver area. However, you might also notice that Space Development Agency in Huntsville is our closest Space Force organization. So it's very important for us down here to connect with them. This is CONUS, but overseas, these are the locations that we have. So this graphic shows you where the overseas locations are located. So some pretty good locations, maybe some that you're like, it's not so great. I don't want to be up in Greenland. But anyways, the locations are pretty amazing, right? So I bet you're kind of thinking, that's cool, but what is the Space Force actually doing at those locations? So let's go ahead and dive into that. All right, I know it's another very busy slide, but I really want to try to give you as much information as I can during this brief so you have a better understanding of Space Force. So let me walk through this real quick. All right, so what you're seeing is we control space systems across all the different orbital regimes, including GEO, MEO, HEO, and LEO. Space Force communication satellites are essential for secure, reliable, and global communications for the U.S. military and its allies. PNT satellites, they allow military personnel, aircraft, ships, and vehicles to pinpoint their exact location wherever they are on Earth. And then they provide precise timing data, which is a piece a lot of people forget about, to synchronize military systems, communications, and operations. Space Force also has missile warning systems that detect and they track ballistic missiles. They provide early warning of missile launches to protect U.S. and its allies. These systems really, they rely on space-based sensors and ground-based radars to monitor both the Earth's surface and space missile activity. Space domain awareness satellites, they track objects and activities in space to ensure that the safety and security of U.S. and allied assets is there. They also help detect, identify, and assess any potential threats that might be out there. And then down on the bottom, you'll see the Space Force electromagnetic warfare systems, and they defend against jamming and interference. They also gather vital intelligence, and they provide an offensive capability in the electromagnetic spectrum. All right, but we couldn't do any of this without the right talent. Our Guardians and Airmen, they think creatively, they adapt quickly, and they bring a fresh perspective to keep us ahead of the curve in this rapidly changing landscape. So in the middle, you'll see a demographic table for the Space Force. I know it's probably a bit hard to read, but I want you to focus on two key points here. All right, first, nearly 58% of the Space Force, they have a bachelor's degree or higher, which is pretty high for a service. But with that, additionally, almost 50% of the service is composed of officers, compared to just 20% in the Air Force and even lower percentages in all the other services. So while the other branches are much larger in size, this reflects kind of that the Space Force is a highly technical service, which relies on advanced technology and specialized expertise. And the Space Force really places a strong emphasis on innovation, research, and development. And officers, especially those with advanced degrees or specialized training, are pivotal for leading and developing new technologies, tactics, and strategies. And then on the right side, you see are all the different officer career fields in the Space Force. And what you can tell from that is they're highly technical. All right, so before I present our guest speaker, I want to leave you with a few facts about the Space Force. We were established 5 years ago, but please don't be fooled into thinking that the need for a separate service was envisioned only 5 years ago. When I came in 22 years ago, we were talking about a separate Space Corps being necessary for our mission set. Our motto is Semper Supra, which means always above. It really just reflects our focus on space superiority, continuous innovation, and the commitment to national defense. Our core values are character. So think demonstrating integrity, honesty, and moral fortitude in all actions. Connection, so emphasizing the importance of teamwork and collaboration. Commitment, representing dedication to the mission, but also to self-progression as well. And courage, so that willingness to take bold actions, to speak power to truth, make those tough decisions, and have resiliency along the way. All right, so I'll go ahead and stop here so you can read about the Space Force symbol on your own. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Brigadier General retired Damon Feltman. General Feltman, I've included a few career highlights on the slide, but really they do not fully capture the breadth of your accomplishments. So please feel free to introduce yourself further.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Stephen, and thanks everybody for letting me be here. So in comp check, so making sure that everybody can hear me.
Yeah, we got your line clear.
Good, good. All right, give me just a second to adjust one of my settings here. Yeah, so this is me. I'm Damon Feltman, and thanks, Stephen, for inviting me to participate in this. You can see the macro version of my career. So my entire adult life has been in the Air Force and in U.S. Space Force space missions. Started out as a lieutenant doing spacecraft operations out in Colorado Springs, and then a few years later ended up going into the reserve because the Air Force Reserve and Air National Guard have had some space missions in them for quite a while, and then did the preponderance of my career in the Air Force Reserve supporting Space Force missions. Finished up the end of my military career as the Deputy Chief of Requirements, Strategy, and Budgeting at Headquarters Space Force up in the Pentagon. Was up there for about 18 months, I think it was, and then the last like 3 or 4 months, actually it was about 4 months. I was on full-time orders as the deputy during a transition period. Following that, I went to Space Development Agency. Stephen had talked about that just a moment ago. That organization, they have a operations center here in Huntsville. I was the chief of the space data transport function that is being built out under Space Development Agency. I did that for a period of time, and then I retired from civil service just a few months ago and established my own independent consulting company called OXR Consulting. And principally what I do there is I advise companies trying to go into the space market, companies that are in the space market, trying to market their services to the Department of Defense and other government organizations, and provide strategic advisement and leadership, things of that sort. And in the meantime, I also volunteer with a couple of organizations. One is the Association of Commercial Space Professionals. That organization supports the training and advisement and advocacy surrounding the space regulatory environment. If someone in this audience is a commercial space company trying to put some hardware into orbit, you know how challenging the regulatory environment can be. And ACSP does a lot of training on those subject points and tries to help streamline the regulatory process for the commercial industry. And finally, I'm the president of the Space Force Association's Huntsville chapter. SFA is a nonprofit that advocates and supports for the Space Force, and is a nationwide. Actually, it's a global organization. We have chapters in Europe and I think in Japan, but mainly here in the U.S. So it's a global organization that supports the Space Force and the premise of U.S.-led space power. The last thing I'll point out is that I'm glad here to be supporting UTSI, the University of Tennessee Space Institute. It's always fun to be in the Southeast doing things with Southeastern Conference universities. But as you can see at the bottom there, I'm a proud graduate of Mississippi State University. So for the UT folks, I'm sorry, but I've got to go Hail State, and I wore the appropriate colors for my university since I'm here with the here in the SEC. So with that, I will pause, and I'm glad to take any questions if there might be.
All right, Damon, I'll ask you the first question. So one of the questions we received in the registration was, how do you see the Space Force fitting in with all the other branches going into the future? How do you expect for them to provide that joint capability going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question there. So the way the Space Force fits in with the other services is going to be no different than how the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and Marines work together today. We in the U.S. we fight wars as in a joint fashion, meaning that we have combatant commands that are called joint organizations. The combatant commands are built for specific missions at specific moments in time to do the nation's bidding, and they collect resources from the services to achieve their objectives. So, as the video at the very beginning pointed out, space is a contested environment, principally by China and Russia, although there are plenty of adversarial capabilities that don't require a China or a Russia to use. But the U.S., I should say, the Western way of economy and security and defense are critically tied to space. So the Space Force will, in my estimation, be kind of the lead echelon of high intensity conflict. So in years past, you could argue that before you could do a land campaign, before you could do a sea campaign, you needed to have air superiority. I grew up in the Air Force, and that was one of our core doctrinal tenets, that you had to have air superiority in order to enable land and maritime activity. Well, I'm moving further left in the timelines and higher in elevation. My estimation is you have to have space superiority before you can have air superiority, before you can have land and maritime superiority. So the Space Force has a growing and very critical role in national security and U.S. defense.
That was fantastic. Any other questions?
Is this time for general questions altogether, or are you reserving that till the very end?
No, go right ahead.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. So in my previous life, how tightly coupled are you to the NRO as far as working, cooperating together? I mean, we used to advocate and budget for their lift vehicles. So I'm just wondering how that's working with the Space Force.
Sure. So I'll give a little bit of inside baseball for those who aren't familiar with NRO and kind of how it's organized. So the National Reconnaissance Office is one of the U.S. government's premier intelligence community organizations. It does the majority of the U.S. intelligence community's space-based operations. All right, so that's who the NRO is. So there's often a question about, well, why do we have the NRO doing things in space, and we have previously the Air Force and now the Space Force and U.S. Space Command and all these other organizations. Part of the answer has to do with U.S. law. Okay, so the NRO, strictly speaking, falls under a section of U.S. law called Title 50, and that deals with intelligence activities. Whereas the Space Force, like all the other services, are in Title 10. So those two titles have different legal authorities and different legal boundaries. So the Space Force is a service, just like the Army, Navy, Marines, etc. And the NRO is an intelligence agency, different authorities, different responsibilities, etc. So what does that mean for how we cooperate? So the Space Force, just like the other services, contributes manpower to the National Reconnaissance Office. Although the Space Force provides the lion's share of military manpower into the NRO, something like 75% of the military authorizations that are inside the NRO come from the Space Force. So there's a lot of partnership going on there. The Space Force and NRO talk a lot about how their acquisition strategies are playing out. We try to avoid duplication of efforts at times. That's not always perfect, but there is dialogue that helps share money to buy one thing instead of buying two separate things. And then finally, there is cooperation between the NRO and U.S. Space Command because there's so many space assets, U.S. government space assets out there in space, that the NRO cooperates with U.S. Space Command to ensure that U.S. interests are protected in space. Does that answer the question?
Yes. I saw somebody else had a question. I'll hold the rest of mine for after that.
Yeah, it looks like we've got several questions in the chat. Stephen, I see you're liking those. Do you want me to read those to you all, or do you want to take it?
I can go ahead and read those out to General Feltman.
Okay.
So first question's from Sydney Glover. Along the same line as the question, how do you see Space Force integrating into the joint JTAG structure?
Yeah. So JTAGs, that is a good question. I'm very familiar with JTAGs. In a past life, I was a Overhead persistent infrared person, OPIR. OPIR is the technology that we do missile warning with, and OPIR is the basis for missile warning and missile defense. It's early warning, and it's inside the chain of custody for missile warning and missile defense. And JTAGs is a set of ground-based architectures that the Army procured coming out of the first Gulf War back in the 90s, because the architecture at that time was built around strategic missile warning, just looking for the mass raid coming out of the Soviet Union. Okay, and then during the Gulf War, we discovered, holy cow, that this architecture, in certain cases, can see short-range missiles like Scuds. The problem was that the communications chain only went in one direction. It was for strategic missile warning over to the United States. It wasn't meant to feed communications into theater where you want to know about short-range missiles. So that's where the Army came up with JTAGs. Okay, so that's the background on that. Now the question is, how does JTAGs go forward? So this system is part of the establishment of U.S. Space Command. I'm sorry, U.S. Space Force. Certain assets that belonged to the Army and the Navy were transferred into the Space Force. JTAGs was one of those architectures that was transferred into the Space Force. And now there's a question, well, what do we do with JTAGs in the long term? This is my personal opinion. It is not the official opinion of the U.S. government, not the opinion of Space Force, U.S. Space Command, the Army. My personal perspective is that the utility of JTAGs as it exists today is probably in its sunset for the following reasons. We have spent at least a generation, if not two generations, refining the comm architectures so that comm goes in both directions. It goes to the U.S., it goes to theater, often simultaneously, and there's more data coming into theaters than ever before. That's kind of part one. The other piece is the evolution of space-based missile warning has gone through a mass transformation in recent years, and the big push actually starts this calendar year. So back in 2018, 2019, this missile warning architecture was re-envisioned to add more sensors, not only at geostationary where they've always been, but to add a layer at medium Earth orbit. And then Space Development Agency came in and started adding satellites at low Earth orbit. And this year, Space Development Agency is scheduled to launch, I believe it's 28 low Earth orbiting missile warning, missile track spacecraft. So the ability to see a lot better, dimmer targets, shorter burning targets, that's going to go through the roof. And secondly, the architecture that Sivers High, the MEO tracking layer that Space Systems Command is building, and then the tracking layer that Space Development Agency is building, it will be pushing richer data more often than what JTAGs is receiving today. So it's quite likely that architecture will be cheaper and faster than it will be to recapitalize JTAGs. Again, my opinion.
That was fantastic. Next question I have, sir, is from Christopher Rodriguez. What could be the role of a consulting company like OXR Consulting in supporting the Space Force?
Yeah, all right. So shameless business development conversation here really quick. So I'll step away from my company and just kind of talk about commercial companies supporting the Space Force. And I'll approach it from that direction. And as a result, that kind of sucks my company up into the narrative, but I'll approach it from a different direction. Number one, in recent years, since the Space Force has been established, Space Systems Command, which is the premier acquisition organization for the Space Force, has established its commercial front door, and that activity is intended to create more transparency and more opportunities for commercial companies to see what's going on inside of the major acquisition activities of the Space Force. There's a commercial services office that mainly does commercial SATCOM, but they also do, I think, commercial imaging in there as well. So broadly speaking, the Space Force recognizes that if it can buy a service rather than build a service, it will try to do that. Next, there has been a uptick in the budget of U.S. U.S. defense space activities. So, and the Space Force controls the majority of that. There's a narrative out there that, hey, the Space Force's budget has doubled in the past couple of years, and that's true. But a lot of that was just consolidation of existing dollars that were already floating around inside of the DoD. Then there was some additive on top of that. But still, the Space Force's actual budget has increased. A lot of that capability is going to be developed by commercial companies. And then there's anticipation that the Trump administration, because he was a big space proponent, he created Space Command, created Space Force, or his administration did through cooperation with Congress, did those things, that that we're in an era of renewed investment in space, and tons of that's going to happen through commercial channels. And if you happen to be a consultant like me on the outside, that creates opportunities.
Perfect. I think you actually answered another question too, talking about commercial integration with Space Force. So moving on, Chris Soley wants to know, do you think the administration might attempt to have the NRO moved under the Space Force, especially given the nomination of Dr. Minke as SecAF?
Yeah, so number one, thanks, Chris. So Chris is a former coworker from U.S. Space Command, but it's a very great question. So if you follow what's going on with all the nominations last week or 2 weeks ago, my understanding of how the gentleman pronounces his last name is Mink, but I don't know him firsthand. But Troy Mink is the deputy director of the NRO until he was nominated. It's interesting. So this is, I think, the first Secretary of the Air Force nomination ever that has had such a deep heritage in space. And then the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force also is a space person. So that's a signal right there that the Trump administration plans to keep its eye on maturation of space technology inside of the DoD. This discussion about what to do with the NRO in the Space Force, previously Air Force, cycles through every couple of years. There's such a, the casual observer, there's a lot of apparent duplication of effort that they're like, hey, why don't we just combine the organizations? Like I said, legally, the two organizations have different authorities and they exist for different purposes. So the more common dialogue that I hear is have the NRO take on more activities than the Space Force and previously the Air Force. The real trade space, in my mind, is both the NRO and the Space Force have assets in space that are being operated to collect or provide certain pieces of data. But before you get to this end part, in the center, you have to buy stuff. You have to buy stuff that goes into space so it can push data to the edges to users and provide, effects. So there could be some trade space in there for how to further reform acquisition. Because if you go back in history and read all the dialogue about the creation of the Space Force, there was a big push about consolidating and refining and making more efficient the space acquisition model. And so there could be, debates about that.
All right, fantastic. Next question, sir, is from David Bird. Basically, how do you see or are there any ways that you have thoughts on the academia can help support the Space Force, either via research or developing future guardians?
Yeah, I'm not terribly close to this line of work inside of the Space Force, although I know, number one, the Space Force has a university partnership program where they've got agreements with a handful of universities, I think it's like 10, to facilitate research activities. So I would say Google Search University Partnership Program. Then, of course, the Space Force through it's the Air Force Research Lab. So if you remember back to Stephen's slide about this Air Force still providing some support, to the Space Force. One of those things is the Air Force's lab system. The University of Tennessee is UTSI is co-located with Arnold Air Force Base. That's one of the labs. Actually, it's a test center. Slight difference, but the major labs are the Air Force Research Lab, under which you have AFWorks and SpaceWorks. So Space Force does have interest areas and funds money into the Air Force Research Lab for SBIRs, STTRs, things of that sort. So if you're plugged into that environment, you'll be contributing to this the developing Space Force capabilities. Then, you know, the dialogue today has talked a lot about or mentioned Space Systems Command a couple of times. Keep in mind, and Stephen pointed out a little bit, Space Force has two other acquisition organizations. One is Space RCO, Space Rapid Capabilities Office, and Space Development Agency, where I used to work. Both of those organizations do have some of their own direct research dollars and funding processes. So like Space Development Agency does a broad area announcement every year. It just got published last week. It's accessible at www.sda.mil. It's broad area announcement for space technology. And so it's like a 14-page document of all the key areas that they want to look at. And you write a 2-page white paper, and that starts the process. So there's plenty of ways for academia and other companies to support Space Force. Oh, I'm sorry, in developing future guardians. So I'll hit on that really quickly. This is another unique departure between the Air Force and the Space Force. The Air Force's model for professional education, the Air Force was, you went through something like ROTC or the Air Force Academy. There was a period of time where you had a lieutenant's course called the Air and Space Basic Course, but that's since been retired. There was a captain's course. Then there was a year-long course as a major called Air Command and Staff College down in Montgomery, Alabama. Then a couple of years later, there's a lieutenant colonel / colonel course called Air War College, again in Montgomery. And all the services have a model kind of like this, but Space Force chose to be deliberately different. Instead of recreating all the infrastructure that goes along with these with some of these schools, number one, they lean on the Air Force and the other services a little bit, but the premier education and training that goes on when you're a major, lieutenant colonel, and colonel, they partner with Johns Hopkins University. So guardians who are selected for that program go to DC and do a 1-year immersion program at Johns Hopkins. And so they get a bachelor's degree in international security with an emphasis in space. So.
All right, I think we got time for maybe 2-ish more questions. So
okay.
Caleb Brimhall asked, how do you expect the Space Force to interact with foreign adversaries in cislunar and lunar with the Parallel Gateway Orbital Station and the Chinese Lunar Station coming up?
Yeah, let me read this here. So, Kev, that really is a great question. The Space Force today has more mission than it has people and money for. That's not my opinion. That was the Secretary Kendall, the former Secretary of the Air Force, who was in one of the pictures Stephen showed earlier. His commentary back in November-ish, I think it was that in reality, the Space Force needs 2 to 3 times the money and people that it has for all of its assigned missions. So, interact is an interesting word. I would say let's streamline this question just a little bit. How do you expect the Space Force to be part of the cislunar and lunar activities, while China is up there and working with Russia, et cetera? So number one, today China, it has its own space station, not a problem. China, notionally, the basic concept of China having a lunar station is not a big deal, but the place where it gets really awkward is everything that China does is done for the purpose of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and almost all of it routes in some way through the military. So arguably, when we talk about militarization of space, there is a thread of all of this Chinese development being militaristic in nature. So this, and certainly if you read China's narratives, its published work, it sees the moon as a resource that's filled with platinum metals. It's filled with helium-3. It's filled with water. It's the early accessible gateway to minerals and things that one have high value here on Earth, but also open up space for further exploration. So, in the very near term, I don't. In very near term, let's call it 5 to 10 years. We'll call it 5 years. It's going to be watch and see. See what the intelligence is telling us, see what the development pace is telling us. On the longer term, the Space Force is going to have to put eyes and potentially effort in that direction. The place where it makes the most security sense so U.S. national security interests, global security interests, is for the U.S. commercial and civil industries and partnerships, like via the Artemis Accords, to have a U.S. and Western-led presence on the moon first, because whoever gets there first sets the norms and conditions. Just like when Russia launched Sputnik first, it established the right of overflight. So, while the U.S. might not have liked the fact that Sputnik was, flying over and beeping every 90 minutes, it established a precedent that Russia didn't care that it was overflying U.S. territory unannounced. So now it means that the reciprocal should also work. So if we're able to get to the moon first and establish Western-based peaceful purpose norms of behavior, that's a good thing. Because if we wait until the U.S. military shows up, then it's too late. So I hope that helps.
That was a fantastic explanation. I'm going to leave you with one question that I think will be very interesting given your reserve time is, what are the expectations for opportunities for full-time and part-time guardians within the single component construct?
Yeah. Okay. So for those who aren't familiar with the context of that question, as I mentioned before, my career started off in the active duty Air Force. I went to the Air Force Reserve, and I commented about the National Guard. So under the Air Force model, you have 3 components. You have the active duty Title 10, just the Air Force. You have the Reserve Title 10 called the Air Force Reserve, and you have the National Guard, which is Title 10 and Title 32. So it has 2 statuses in federal law. When the Space Force was established, the enabling law under the National Defense Authorization Act was really muddy and gray about what to do with the Guard and Reserve. What a lot of people didn't realize was that the Guard and Reserve, let's go back to November 1st, 2019, a month before the creation of the Space Force. 40% of the manpower doing DoD space operations was in the Guard and Reserve. In some cases, nearly 100% of certain mission functions were existing in the Guard and Reserve. And so it was a swing and a miss by the legislators who were writing all the law. It just didn't register with them that so much was in the Guard and Reserve. So it's taken a lot of time to get this straightened out. On the reserve side, what has happened is the National Defense Authorization Act for 2024 created this means by which, instead of having a separate reserve and a separate active duty with separate, we call them roles. It's basically manpower documents. These get combined, and they're managed as one. That you're able to, that people in these positions are able to move back and forth in part-time and full-time status, which I really hate that word, part-time and full-time. There's no such thing as part-time military work. It's all work that all has to get done all the time. It's just that a person might not be available all the time to do the work. But anyhow, the opportunities, certainly the Space Force has put a lot of thought already onto the full-time work, because that's the easiest thing that they know about. So there are previously reservists who have gone through the process to apply to come into this new model, and they are being assessed in as new guardians. You have these part-time members where the Space Force is still trying to figure out how it manages this architecture of bodies of people who, Monday through Friday, 20-something days a month, they work for company X, Y, or Z, but for a few days a month, they are on an ops floor in Colorado Springs or something like that. That model is still offered to them. The Air Force Reserve manages that whole machine for the Air Force. The Space Force now has to figure out how it wants to do that. So what does that mean for part-time Guardians is a little bit to be determined. And that's a bit of a piece of friction hanging out there. So I think I'll stop with that.
All right, sir. I just want to thank you, General Feltman, for coming and taking the time out of your very, very busy schedule to share some of those insights, because I could not have answered those questions like you did. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that and engage with both the UTK and the UTSI teams that are here.
Sure thing. Glad to participate. I was teasing UT at the beginning about being an SEC guy from Mississippi State, but genuinely glad to have been here to support the mission of UTSI and support spreading information, educating folks about what the Space Force is. So it's a very valuable addition to U.S. national defense. So thanks so much.
Yes, sir. You're welcome back anytime. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. So these are all the different things that we talked about. You got to understand a little bit more about the Space Force, where it's located, its core functions, how it differs in its organizational structure. And then you got a lot of time with General Feltman, which is, an asset to answer all those questions the way he did. So I don't have time for more questions, but what I'll do is I'll leave you with this quote, right? So in our 3 years of existence, we've studied, we've wargamed, and experimented with new ways to do business and how to develop our personnel. As a result, I centered on 3 lines of effort that shape how I approach challenges: fielding combat-ready forces, amplifying the Guardian spirit, and partnering to win. And so you are exactly, all the people that are online right now, you're exactly the kind of partners that General Saltzman was talking about. So your collaboration is essential as we work together to secure space and achieve our common goals. Strong partnerships are going to be vital for tackling that ever-changing challenges that we're going to be facing in space and making sure that we're resilient against our enemy threats. All right, so here's some more of the resources that I used to put this briefing together, along with some additional reading material. If you're really interested in exploring these topics further, we'll make these slides available and the links as well. And then these resources, they're really just going to provide that more in-depth information and context to help you gain a deeper understanding of the key points that I covered here today. All right, so I really hope that you found this first part of the series informative. And we really look forward to seeing you guys at the next session, which will be on February 7th, where we will reveal the risk and provide an unclassified overview of threats to space assets. And our guest speaker at that will be Lieutenant Colonel John Vinson, who's the commander of the 74th Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Squadron, which is doing a lot of threat application analysis. So pending any last minute, real quick questions. What I will say is oh yeah, go ahead.
Hi, this is Joe Bullington. I'm in the Huntsville chapter with Damon. I'm one of his leads in that chapter. And somebody asked a question about how to get more information on the Huntsville chapter, and I put that in the chat. I just want to make sure everybody knows that they're interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's a great chapter. Anybody's welcome to come out. And Damon will give you a lot more information about that if you're interested. Hope to see you maybe at that next one. And then again, thank you for attending, and I hope to see you again in 2 weeks for the next part of this 4-part series. Thank you.